In 1936, one of the United States' most beloved rail companies, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, jumped on the streamlined bandwagon in grand style. They launched an entire fleet of silver, lightweight, diesel-powered trains across their system, with the latest and finest equipment to carry passengers across the American West in style. In addition to the transcontinental name trains like the Super Chief and the El Capitan, there were also a few new daytime streamliners covering shorter distances, including one that ventured south from Los Angeles to a city that seemed off of the beaten path, San Diego. The aptly named San Diegan didn't sound as glamorous as its transcontinental counterparts, but the path it took turned its modest inner-city route into an inspiration for the rest of the world. Opened for passengers and freight in 1888, the Santa Fe Surf Line has been one of the company's rather understated main lines, but it had lots of activity going for it. It turned south from LA and served the inland communities within the Orange Empire before meeting the surf just south of San Juan Capistrano. From here, the rails would skirt alongside the sands of the Pacific Ocean, and beachgoers could be dropped off just steps from the waves at San Clemente Pier, Oceanside, Carlsbad, Encinitas, and Del Mar. After 127 miles, they will be smooth sailing into San Diego proper, pulling to a stop at the Spanish-style depot next to downtown. Because of its route alongside the surf between two large cities, passenger trains had a strong base of patrons going to work or leisure, while freight could keep the finest city and its naval stronghold well supplied. So, when Santa Fe introduced the San Diegan on March 27, 1938, it brought with it a new touch of glamour and modernity to an already thriving route. The one train set can make 2 round trips each day, but passenger demand ushered in a second train just 3 years later, doubling the schedule's frequency. They were conveniently scheduled according to their environment, for taking commuters between work and home, for beachgoers hitting the waves between dawn and dusk, for local travelers doing business or visiting friends, and for long-distance travelers connecting with the transcontinental Super Chief and El Capitan. The line's peak capacity would be reached in World War II, when the city's naval base called for as many as 42 trains per day to carry troops to the war effort, with the San Diegans operating in the minority. Post-war, activity simmered down to 3 San Diegans each day. Between 1950 and 1970, the state's population was expected to expand by 90%, but more people were going by road than rail. This demographic shift didn't seem to bother the Santa Fe, particularly with passenger trains across the system, including the San Diegans, authorized to run at speeds up to 90 miles per hour, leaving highway speed limits in the dust. With as many as 300,000 passengers riding every year on average, Santa Fe saw this service as an experimental testbed in maintaining its relevance in a changing world. The most successful of these experiments was held in 1956, when Santa Fe took on a new fleet of 55 high-level passenger cars. Their first revenue assignment was on the Surf Line, where they served for a few months before going into service on the El Capitan. By letting this route's passenger base sample the new equipment, the San Diegan was promoting Santa Fe's big picture about its commitment to the passenger rail business. By now, road travel was gaining momentum with the Interstate Highway Act that same year, and airlines were catching up fast on rail's ridership, surpassing it the next year. Despite all of these new players, Santa Fe's confidence in their own superiority had not been shaken, and their system-wide service was still unaffected. That was, though, until the U.S. Postal Service discontinued the mail contracts for the Surf Line, which meant that the trains as a whole were making less money. Up to this point, the Santa Fe and most other railroads had long depended on revenue from carrying mail to cover their passenger trains' operating costs. That revenue was now leaving rail behind in favor of air and road travel. It wouldn't be until 1967 when Santa Fe started to purge its money-losing trains. As threadbare as the timetable appeared, though, the fact that the 3 San Diegans were still operating as frequently as they did proved that the supportive base of passengers had never changed. At a time when competitors were cutting service any which way they could, the Santa Fe had long viewed its passenger trains as a symbol of the railroad, and of the country too. Management tried hard to keep its service out of the incoming, nationalized brand of Pax Rail to maintain the train's first-class status, but forecasts from within the company and independent contractors predicted that the operating losses of all remaining passenger trains would bankrupt the railroad in as little as 3 years. Only then did Santa Fe sign up to join what would become Amtrak. The change would be made on May 1, 1971, with one of the 3 San Diegans replaced by a short-lived extension of the Los Angeles to Seattle Coast Starlight, which lasted barely 6 months. In 1976, the state of California offered funding to improve all of Amtrak's service within the state. Some of it went to the Surf Line, and the 4th round trip was added that year. The next year, a 5th train was added. Then a 6th one the year after. By 1980, 7 San Diegans per day were shuttling passengers on a daily basis. With the passage of time, the effects of the state's population expansion was becoming visible. As driving was becoming less pleasurable with gridlock and smog, turning to rail was looking much more civilized, comfortable, and energy efficient. To accommodate this growth, the track was upgraded for shorter journey times, and station stops were either relocated or modernized for better connections with the outside world. With the additional state-supported trains, over 1 million passengers were riding each year, effectively tripling over the decade. The Surf Line was no longer off of the beaten path, but a well-traveled urban corridor. But there was more activity coming down the line, including a changing of the guard. In 1992, the segment between Los Angeles and the border between Orange and San Diego counties was sold by the Santa Fe to the Southern California Regional Rail Authority. This is the firm who established Metrolink, a commuter rail system that ferries workers between Los Angeles and its outlying suburbs. Although offering daily commuter service with more stops in more communities, its emphasis is on weekday peak periods, which could add nearly 30 trains to the timetable. With service extending south to Oceanside, this half of the line would become a beehive of activity, with trains taking passengers not just to LA along their Orange County line, but also to San Bernardino, with the Inland Empire Orange County line, making the country's first ever suburb-to-suburb commuter rail service. At the same time as SCRA's purchase, the southern half of the Surf Line was split between the North County Transit District and San Diego's MTS. 3 years later, the city introduced its own commuter service between Oceanside and San Diego. The coaster runs over 20 trains a day with over 5,000 passengers on weekday peak periods. Like the Metrolink, the coaster caters to more communities than the San Diegan would just fly through, given how Amtrak's focus was on taking passengers across the whole line. In fact, the company tried a non-stop version of the train for business travelers, which did not last long. And yet, the San Diegan was not being left out of the expansion craze. Beginning in 1988, an 8th San Diegan was running north of Los Angeles to Santa Barbara. Within days, this one train was boasting the highest ridership and revenue figures out of the San Diegan family, which would spur another extension to San Luis Obispo in 1995. By then, there were 11 San Diegans carrying passengers over a total of 350 miles, more than double the train's original route. As such, by running over such a long distance beyond its original scope, the San Diegan name seemed rather outdated, especially with new equipment coming online in the new millennium. On June 1st, 2000, the entire service was rebranded as the Pacific Surfliner. Today's Surfline is a far cry from its relaxed days of the Santa Fe. Between the 13 Surfliner trains, 29 Metrolink trains, 22 coasters, and at least 1 or 2 freights from BNSF, this rail line sees over 60 trains per day in each direction. To put that into perspective, the only other rail line in the US that's even busier than this is the Northeast Corridor between Boston, New York, and Washington, D.C. That makes the Surf Line the second busiest rail line in the country, and it's only going to get busier. In 2016, the North Coast Corridor was initiated to expand the route's capacity, allowing for even more trains to move more freely. Planned improvements include, but aren't limited to, double-tracking the entire route from San Diego to Oceanside, replacing wooden trestles with concrete spans, adding crossovers for trains to change tracks, and adding limited-use stations at special venues like the Del Mar Fairgrounds. These goals all help with expanding the Surf Line's capacity, as it must accommodate the region's population growth and increasing travel demands. What makes this route so successful is the fact that it connects two large cities reasonably close to each other, with journey times that are too short to fly and too long to drive. Other successful rail corridors that fit this description include California's other rail services between the Bay Area, Sacramento, and Bakersfield, which have experienced similar growth patterns prompting more frequent service. Beyond the state's borders, other success stories are operating in Oregon, Washington, Florida, and throughout the Midwest. More recently, the state of Virginia has spent $3.7 billion on purchasing rail lines from CSX, with plans to expand capacity for Amtrak, the Virginia Railway Express, and potentially high-speed rail between Washington, D.C., Richmond, and points further south. Given the distances between these cities, anywhere between 200 or 400 miles apart, the conditions are right for rail's advantages. In a world of increasingly crowded interstates, short-haul air routes, an ever-growing population base, and environmental consciousness, it's little wonder why ridership on the Surf Line has been on the rise over the past half-century. In this new millennium, new additions like the Sprinter between Oceanside and Escondido, and expansion of the San Diego Trolley have all made for more transportation options for people in Orange and San Diego counties that most other parts of the country could dream of. It is in these inner-city routes that rail travel is at its finest, convenient and economical. For a route that seemed to be off of the beaten path, the Surf Line would ultimately prove that passenger trains like the San Diegan don't need to be as glamorous and star-studded as the Super Chief to make a positive impact for the world.